told BC before class that I was a little hesitant about this class, Daniel, after getting into it. And this one has really, I almost wanted to say, it's kind of kicked my rear in trying to understand it all and to put things in perspective. And it ought to be easy, and maybe I'm reading too much into it of the book. But tonight we'll start kind of an introduction in the history of Babylon, and we may and may not get into chapters 1 this evening, but there's some, I felt that it's important that we that we deliver the background, we bring the background into Daniel of what's going on. So, first of all, we have Daniel the man, and his name, Daniel, means God is my judge. And he probably came from a noble family, because normally the people of prominence of a nation were taken captive, and so he was one that was taken captive, which fulfilled Isaiah's earlier prophecy over in Isaiah 39 verse 7. And then also, if you remember when we studied in 2 Kings chapter 20, he was carried away while a youth, about 15 years old, to Babylon during the 3rd year of Jehoiakim, along with the other elite men of Judah. And he was given the name of Belteshazzar, which meant, may he protect the king. And he was instructed in the wisdom and science of the Chaldeans. And this was the name that he was given when he was taken into Babylon. And so while there in Babylon, he was being prepared for royal service. And he was allowed by his advisor to live on vegetables and water rather than eating rich food and wine. And we'll get into the whys of that in chapter 1. And his dedication made him a better student than his Babylonian counterparts. And we'll get into that also, where he says, I want you to let me live off of this food for 10 days and see that I'm still able to perform what you want me to do. And God gave him gifts in an understanding of mysteries and the interpretation of dreams, and he used them to interpret 2 dreams for Nebuchadnezzar in chapters 2 and 4. He remained steadfast in his devotion to God, and he distinguished himself by his ability and his understanding. He was eventually made ruler over the province of Babylon and chief of the governors over its wise men, and he interpreted writing for Belshazzar, who was probably the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar, and was further honored, and we'll study that in chapter 5. Under Darius the Mede, who succeeded Belshazzar, he was one of the 3 presidents of the satraps. His enemies made an attempt to do away with him, and he was cast into the den of lions, which we all studied as young people and kids when Daniel was thrown into the den of lions. And but yet he was miraculously delivered because God was with him. And his opponents, knowing that Daniel prayed, and the reason he got there was because the people that did not like him knew that Daniel prayed 3 times daily to God. And they had tricked Darius into issuing a law which prohibited anyone from praying to any god or man for 30 days. But Daniel continued. And even though Darius regretted his command, he could not legally change it, and therefore he had to cast Daniel into the lion's den. Darius believed in God, and he believed God would deliver Daniel. And after a sleepless night, he rose early the next morning and saw that Daniel had been indeed preserved by God. The enemies of Daniel, along with their wives and children, were cast into the den of lions, and they, of course, were immediately consumed. Daniel continued in high office of all the Babylonian period and remained in office under Cyrus, the king of the Medo-Persian Empire, which eventually conquered Babylon in around 538 BC. And Daniel did not return to Palestine with the Jews, but most likely spent his last days in Babylon. He's one of the few well-known biblical characters about whom nothing negative is written. His life was characterized by faith, by prayer, by courage, consistency, and lack of compromise. He was greatly beloved, and he was actually mentioned by Ezekiel as an example of righteousness. He was a prophet. He served from approximately 605 BC to 536 BC. He was there during the same time that Jeremiah and Ezekiel was. They were all in exile. And like the other prophets, such as Ezekiel, who ministered directly to the people, he was primarily God's representative in the king's court of the ruling nation. And that kind of reminds me of Elisha and Elijah, where Elisha ruled over the nations, and Elisha was a little bit more focused on the people. Daniel ministered for the full duration of the Babylonian captivity as a prophet and a government official. So, as we remember in our study of Jeremiah and Lamentations, how long was Babylon? I mean, how long was the Jews going to be held captive? 70 years. And so Daniel ministered during the full time of this captivity. And as we'll read, part of his ministry was directed to the Gentile courts of Babylon, and part of it to his Jewish countrymen. The events and prophecies of the book of Daniel, as I mentioned, cover the full length of 70 years in exile. They occurred all during the Babylonian activity. Nebuchadnezzar was returning from Jerusalem to Babylon to assume the throne following the death of his father, and he took several captives with him, including Daniel and his three friends, as I mentioned, in 606 BC. And then there was a second group that was exiled into Babylon under King Jehoiachin, which included Ezekiel, in 597 BC. And then there was a third group that was carried away with the destruction of Jerusalem, which we read about in the last few weeks in Jeremiah in 586 BC. And Jeremiah, as we studied, had cautioned the captives to live in Babylon peaceably and to prosper, and that after 70 years that they would be able to return to their homeland. So we remember studying that he told them, he says, look, you're going to be taken captive, but when you get to Babylon, live there peaceably, buy homes, make friends, have families, and grow gardens, and do everything that you normally would do. And we read about that in Jeremiah 29. From the captivity of the first group of those that were taken to the return of the first group of captives, which was about 536 BC, was 70 years. And from the destruction of Jerusalem and the raising of the temple in 586 to the return of the final group of captives and the completion of the temple was again 70 years. And regarding Babylon, there are some important dates, and that is in 625 BC, they rebelled against Assyria. In 612, Babylon destroyed Nineveh, the capital of Assyria, during that war. And in 609, Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the Assyrian army, leaving Babylon the power of the East. In 605 BC, Nebuchadnezzar returned to Babylon to assume the throne, and he brought the elite of Judah, which included Daniel, with him when he went back to Babylon. And Nebuchadnezzar returned to Judah and carried away Ezekiel and Jehoiakim and 10,000 artisans of Judah. Nebuchadnezzar in 586 returned to Jerusalem a third time. Jerusalem fell and temple was destroyed, and that's when Judah was taken captive. Babylon fell to the Medes and Persians under the reign of Cyrus the Great in 539. And then in 536, a group of exiled Jews returned to Jerusalem under the leadership of Zerubbabel and Joshua. And in 516 BC, the temple was rebuilt. We ask what kind of world was this new home of theirs? And compared to the little country of Palestine, Babylon was a big, rich, and prosperous country. The Jews found advanced culture, big business, and material splendor. And the chief city was one of great wealth and magnificence. It was the center of all activity. Some of the ancient writers describe it as a city surrounded by 4 walls, each 15 miles in length. 24 streets ran north and south, and the same number east and west. In this way, each street terminated at a gate in the wall. And the city was thus made up of more than 600 square blocks. And yes.
Geographically based on today's map, where was Babylon located?
Let's see. I saw that in one of the many books, and that is up in, let's see, is that handout that I gave out. Yeah, where Iraq is, yes. Yeah. It said that in the center of each square, there were 600 square blocks, and it said in the center of each square there was a garden, and that the city contained many elaborate and expensive buildings. And Nebuchadnezzar's wife, who was homesick, he constructed what's known as the famous Hanging Gardens. And what these were really immense terraces that were placed on top of each other until they had reached the height of the city walls. God gave Daniel insight into the kingdoms of the future to show the weakness of the kingdoms of men and the permanence and glory of the kingdom. Babylon was with the great Nebuchadnezzar as its leader, the head of gold. And then Medo-Persian is established by Cyrus, king of Persia. And then Darius, the king of Media, was represented by the breast and arms of silver. And this has to go with one of the dreams that we will cover. And Macedonia, or the Grecian time of Grecian Empire, established by Alexander the Great, and then it was divided into 4 generals, and it was conquered by the Romans in 168 BC. And of one of the dreams, it will represent the belly and the thighs of the bronze. And then the world power established by Caesar, the legs of iron and feet and toes of iron and clay. And then, as we'll get into it in chapter 2 and chapter 7, the kingdom of God is discussed and that it would be the fourth world empire that is established and never be destroyed. So Babylonia was on a plain that was bounded on the north by Assyria and the Mesopotamia, and on the east by Elam, and separated by the mountains of Elam, and on the south side by sea marshes and the country of Chaldea. On the west was the Syrian desert. It was at that time thought to be the cradle of civilization, watered by the Tigris and the Euphrates River, and it's thought that it was the probable site of the Garden of Eden, as discussed in Genesis 2 and 4, and the Tower of Babel. It was covered with a network of canals. They had been skillfully planned and regulated, and they had brought prosperity due to the enhancing of the fertility of the soil. It was established by Nimrod not long after the flood, Genesis 10 and verses 8 through 10. And it was within easy reach of the Persian Gulf, located by the Euphrates River. A lot of battles were fought in Babylon for the control of it. It was destroyed and it was rebuilt a number of times. During Nebuchadnezzar, it was the chief city of the world, covered 200 square miles, had 3 imposing walls around it, which were wide enough to allow chariots to pass on top of them. And then in later history of Babylon, it declined, but but it may still have existed, or parts of it may have still existed in the New Testament time, because in 1 Peter 5 and verse 13, it refers to she who is in Babylon, chosen together with you, sends you her greetings, and so does my son Mark. But Babylon also came to be symbolized in the book of Revelation with all of its wickedness, because in Revelations 14, fallen is Babylon the Great. And also in Revelation 17, the scarlet woman has written on her forehead, Babylon the Great. So that's a little bit about the history of Babylon, and so what we're looking at. But we remember when everybody was taken up into Babylon, they did not serve God. The gods of Babylon were basically the same as those of Assyria. Both nations were very superstitious. They worshipped Marduk, who they said was their creator, and Ea, which was the spirit of water. The gods of the Babylonians were viewed as threats to them, and they believed that their gods always wanted to harm them. And the god of Ea, the spirit of the water, was the only exception, because since the sea brought trade and helped to make them rich, they did not think that way. But of the evil gods, they said that doors cannot shut them out, nor bolts prevent them from entering. They glide like serpents beneath the door and creep through the joints of hinges like a puff of wind. They believed in witches and demons, and they put images to the right and left of the doors of their houses to scare them away. That sounds familiar today. They believed in the power of the stars, in astrology. Astrology actually had its birth in Babylon, and they thought they could tell the future from the stars. They built temples called ziggurats to their gods, and they had inherited that idea from the ancient Sumerians. And these consisted of towers with a number of stages, each one a little bit smaller than the one below. And the most famous was in the city of Babylon, and it had 7 stages, each of a different color: black, orange, red, gold, pale yellow, deep blue, and silver. And each was dedicated to a different heavenly body Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, the Sun, Venus, Mercury, and the Moon. They had many festivals. The big one was the New Year festival, which lasted about two weeks. They believed in life after death. They referred to the place that they believed souls went to after death as the land of no return. And the Babylonians' religion seemed to have little or no influence on the way that they acted. They could be cruel as most of the conquering people of their day, and they utterly burned and destroyed Jerusalem and many other walled cities. They did not glory in cruelty the way the Assyrians had, but the Babylonians tended to leave the people that they captured exactly where they found them as long as they accepted Babylonian rules. And so a submissive city to Babylon that they captured, they would be left standing as long as they paid their tribute. But Judah was defeated, her cities were destroyed, and her people moved because Judah, as we studied, kept rebelling. When they captured people, the people were treated generously. The example of Daniel and his companions, they were trained to serve in the king's palace. They were given honored positions. The Jews, while in captivity, were allowed to become prosperous, develop comfortable colonies. And as we mentioned before in Jeremiah 29, Jeremiah told the captives to build houses, plant gardens, allow their sons to marry, and to prosper. So many Jews actually became rich during this time of that they were in Babylon. So that kind of gives a history of Babylon and Daniel, the individual. So we've got a little bit of time, so we'll dive into the book of Daniel itself. So we'll go to Daniel 1. In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, the king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, into Jerusalem and besieged it. So as we were talking about, this would be the year about 607 BC, or the first time that Jerusalem was sieged when it fell to Nebuchadnezzar. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. So now this in itself is a fulfillment of prophecy of Isaiah chapter 39 and verses 6 and 7, where Isaiah was speaking about how that Judah was going to fall to Babylon, and he declares, "Behold, the days come that all that is in thine house." He's talking to the king Hezekiah, and remember we studied this in Hezekiah. "And that which thy fathers have laid up in store unto this day shall be carried to Babylon. Nothing shall be left, saith the Lord. And of thy sons that shall issue from thee, which thou shalt beget, they shall take away, and they shall be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon." So it was 105 years earlier, in 712 BC. And remember, we studied this in Hezekiah. Hezekiah had been sick, and he prayed to God that he would recover from his sickness. And so then there came certain emissaries from Babylon with messages of congratulations that you're well again, after he had been made well. And Hezekiah showed these men from Babylon the treasures in the house. And so then Isaiah came to Hezekiah, if you'll remember, and said, "Who were those men and why were they here?" And he said, "Well, they're emissaries from another country that's far away, a place called Babylon." And Isaiah asked, "Well, what did they want?" And he said, "Well, they just wanted to tell me that they were glad I recovered from my illness." And he said, "So what did you show them?" And he said, "I showed them all of the treasures in the house of God." And Isaiah became angry, and he prophesied at that time that these Babylonians would come back, and they would carry away all of the treasure to Babylon, and that they would take young men and the princesses and carry them away captives. And 105 years later, it happened. So Nebuchadnezzar came, and as the scripture records, he carried away the treasures from the house of God to put in the house of God in Babylon. So then, the next verse, then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. So Nebuchadnezzar wanted the cream of the crop, is what he wanted. He wanted those that were skillful in science and understanding and that were good looking and strong. And so they did. They took them and they took them to Babylon to teach them the Chaldean language, and so that they might in someday stand in front of Nebuchadnezzar as an advisor and as a counselor to Nebuchadnezzar. So the king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table, and they were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter into the king's service. So here again, yes, sir, I'm sorry.
You know, the translation you have is a little different on verse 3 than the King James and King James. Then the king instructed Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, and go back to Kings where it says they're going to become eunuchs.
Okay, then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family, and he was to teach them the language and literature of Babylonians. Yours says, what does yours say? That they're going to be eunuchs?
The master of his eunuchs, so this guy that he's turning over to, that's who takes care of the eunuchs.
Okay.
Josephus believed that Daniel was eunuch also.
Okay. So a little bit difference in translation there. This is the New International Version, is what I'm reading from. Okay, so in verse 5, the king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. So the idea here was they would get 3 years of training, they would learn the Chaldean language, they would learn the customs of the court, and so that they might stand in the court of the king. But now the king's meat was meat that had been sacrificed to pagan gods. And in those days, whenever a person butchered a lamb or a cow or whatever, they would usually offer it as a sacrifice to their gods, and then they would go ahead and eat it themselves. So, in other words, you roast it, a toast to it, and then you roast it. You take the fat and burn it into the gods. But it was offered as a sacrifice to the gods, and then you ate it. So, and the butchering was part of a religious ritual, which carried on far beyond in the Babylonian period and even into the New Testament period. Andy?
When I worked for Mr. Ansari, who was Muslim, my supervisor, who was Muslim, asked me to go with him to find a goat without blemish and relocate one. It was costly. And then he asked me to assist him as he butchered it. And it was unique, the process that he went through in butchering that animal. And then he was going to take it home and prepare it the way that they normally do, which what we're reading about here is kind of reminiscent of that, helping him do that.
Yeah.
They still do that to this day.
Yeah, they do. They do. So, as I mentioned, this was a part of a religious ritual, and as we just heard, carried on now and on into the New Testament. And so it was a common practice among all the Greeks to have the same type of religious ritual in any butchering of the animal. So you would butcher it off the blood as an sacrifice to your god, and they would take the meat and serve it, or they would sell it. And it was a real problem for Daniel or for a Christian who wanted to eat meat, because you wouldn't want to eat meat that had been offered as a sacrifice to a pagan god, and so it was a real problem. But as what we, in the New Testament, when Paul talked to the Corinthians, he said, don't worry about whether it was offered to a god, and just take it and enjoy it. And so, kind of the deal, your parents have always said, just eat what's set before you, ask no questions. But Daniel did not want to have any part of eating meat that had been sacrificed to pagan deities. So he requested that he not have to partake in this particular manner or partake in the meat that the king offered. And so I say all that so you kind of understand why Daniel didn't want to eat the king's meat. Verse 6, among those who were chosen were some from Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And in the Hebrew, these are pretty names because they all relate to God. Daniel means God is judge. Hananiah is beloved of the Lord. Some of the young, some of you young parents might wondering what your son's name is going to be. But and Mishael, who is God, and Azariah, the Lord is my help. So they all had names that related to God in Hebrew. But the chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, he gave the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah, Shadrach, to Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah, Abednego. So Daniel's name, Belteshazzar, which means Baal's prince, and Baal was one of the gods of the Babylonians. And to Hananiah, he gave the name of Shadrach, and Shadrach means eliminated by the sun god. And to Mishael, he gave the name of Meshach, which means who is like Shach, and Shach was another one of the Babylonian deities. And to Azariah, he gave the name Abednego, which means the servant of Nego, which was another one of the Babylonian deities. So Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, Belteshazzar, these are all names that were given by the eunuch in Babylon as they took away their Hebrew names because their Hebrew names related to God. And they didn't want anything as far as anything that related to God. But Daniel, in verse 8, resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. He didn't want to defile himself with the meat that was offered to the pagan deities. And so he requested that he didn't have to eat it. Now God, in verse 9, had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel. But the official told Daniel, I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would have my head because of you. So here he's saying, look, I'm fearful of the king. I respect you, but Daniel, I'm fearful of the king because I respect him. And he gave me the commands to feed you this. And if you don't eat it, then you guys are going to get skinny and depleted, and then my head is going to be on the chopping block. So Daniel said to the guard in verse 11, whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, and he kind of said, let's have a testing period, okay? Let's just give this period a test. He says, give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see. So he agreed to this, and he tested them for 10 days. And at the end of 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and wine, and they were to drink, and gave them vegetables instead. So I guess this is where vegetarians got their start. I'm not sure, but Verse 17, to these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. And Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them into his service, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. So they were brought to stand before the king. And in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. And so Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus. In chapter 2, let's see, we got 5 minutes. I'm going to stop there. And then we'll pick up with chapter 2 next week. So we've got the history of Babylon, we've got the history of the man Daniel, and now we see the beginning of their service.